just a second, I will be introducing my author for today, and she is Patricia Bell Scott. And I'm just going to try to focus. There we go. And she wrote this book about Eleanor Roosevelt and Pauli Murray. I just wanted to see if I could get this picture clear. This book is just amazing. It talks about the relationship between these two women that they had for 28 years, but more importantly, it talks about the civil rights movement in the 30s and the 40s, 50s, beginning of the 60s, and then after Eleanor died, what Pauli Murray did with the rest of her life until she died in the 80s. And to say it's inspirational is not a strong enough word. Okay, I learned more about the civil rights movement in this book than I've ever learned in any book I've ever read. I had no idea that Eleanor Roosevelt was as involved in the civil rights movement. I had no idea what she did after President Roosevelt had died. I learned so much about the influence that she had, not just when she was First Lady, but more importantly after she was no longer First Lady, and how the heads of state all over the world and even the political leaders in this country took what she said, and it was important. And she made more of a difference than during that time period than I think anyone did. So I can't wait to talk to Patricia. She's a professor at the University of Georgia. And the research that she did, I can't wait to ask her about her journey in writing this, because from what I read, it took her like almost 2 decades to write, and that is not shocking. When you read this and you find out all the history that she sticks in here from those time periods, it is not shocking to know that it took her that long. But anyway, I will be introducing her, and then I will be chatting with you guys after the interview, and talking to you about what my thoughts on the interview. So anyway, here's Patricia.
Hi, everyone. Today I am so blessed to be speaking with author and professor Patricia Bell Scott. And we're going to be talking about her newest book, which is called The Firebrand and the First Lady, a portrait of a French, and it's about Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt and the struggle for social justice. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
What an emotional book this was for me, I just have to say. And, history books, I love history. I dove into this book, and I never learned so much about Eleanor Roosevelt in any other book as I did in this book. You made her so relatable and a person that I felt like when she died, I was like upset. I mean, I really, because there's a lot written about her, and I read a lot of books on Franklin, but it was always kind of like she was this distant person, okay? But the way that you portrayed her as somebody who, so cared, and her writings and, her friendship with Pauli Murray, who I had never heard of, which I am ashamed to say, because what she has done for the civil rights movement, and we don't learn about her, it's crazy. I'm 53, and so when I was in school, we learned very little about the civil rights movement to begin with. But the fact that we never heard of her, I am just so happy that you dedicated this book to the two of them and really brought to light what they did for the civil rights during basically 4 decades.
Well, I am delighted to hear that you feel that you learned something new about Eleanor Roosevelt, because, as you say, there are lots of biographies about her, and my goal in writing this book was to show her in a friendship with Pauli Murray, and with the goal of trying to demonstrate to readers how they came together in a friendship, because these are two unlikely people. Pauli Murray, born in Baltimore but raised in North Carolina by grandparents after the loss of both her father and mother is actually the granddaughter of a mixed-race slave. So she comes from very humble backgrounds in terms of economics, though they were always aspiring educators. She comes from a line of educators. Her grandfather was a teacher in the school for freed slaves. But here is PAULI Murray, granddaughter of mixed-race slaves, and Eleanor Roosevelt, whose ancestry entitled her to membership in the Daughters of the American Revolution. And the two of them came together in friendship, largely as a result of a letter that PAULI wrote to the White House, to the President and Mrs. Roosevelt, protesting segregation in the South. And so I was very curious about what drew them together. How did they sustain this friendship, and how did they change over time? And I was also curious about whether or not this friendship had significance for the nation, and it did. So it was this experience of researching and writing this book was a labor of love to me, and quite an adventure, because you mentioned that you were 53. I will soon turn 67, and am old enough to possibly have met Eleanor Roosevelt, but I did not. But the person that connected me to the project and who was the catalyst for this project is PAULI Murray, who some 30 years ago wrote me a couple of letters encouraging me in the work that I was doing. And in one of the letters, she mentioned her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, and she mentioned the President's Commission on the Status of Women, for which they both served. Eleanor served as the first chair of the commission, though she died before the commission finished its work. And PAULI was a member of one of the subcommittees. And this was just one or two lines in the letter, but it interested me, but not enough to stop me from doing what I was doing at the time. And in the interim, PAULI died. And in fact, when she wrote this letter to me, she was ill, but I did not know that. So I learned 18 months later that she had passed and was devastated. And then it took me several years to decide that it would be interesting to look at some of her letters to Eleanor Roosevelt. And the moment I read the first batch of them, I knew that this was a project that I had to undertake. I didn't know what I would discover about either of them, and it has just been one of the greatest joys in my life to discover what a fascinating friendship it was, and how, despite their differences, they had so many similarities. PAULI was 26 years junior to Eleanor, and they, of course, had very different family origins, but they had a lot in common. I did not know initially that they had the same given name. They both have the first name Anna. They share that first name, but neither of them preferred that name. So Eleanor was always known, obviously it's Eleanor, and PAULI was always known as, she's Anna Pauline, and she shortened Pauline and was known for much of her life as PAULI. They were both they were orphaned in childhood. They both lost both parents at a young age, and they were raised by elderly kin. I was interested to learn that they, as young girls, showed abiding compassion for people and animals who were helpless. They were both dog lovers, as am I, and I was intrigued to know how much they care for their pets. They both had a need for acceptance, and they both suffered ridicule as young women. Eleanor was ridiculed for her protruding teeth, and PAULI had a boyish physique. She was tomboyish, and so she was ridiculed for that. I did not know early on that they were both lifelong Episcopalians. PAULI left the church once, but came back, and other than that, remained in the church. And in the last 7 years of her life became a priest, and she is a person of significance in the Episcopal Church in that she's the first African American woman to be ordained as an Episcopal priest, and she was also named to the book of Holy Men, Holy Women. So she's a saint in the Episcopal Church. Yes. I was interested in that they were both voracious readers. They were women who had a deep sense of purpose once they chose a goal. They both loved to write. That they were both women of tremendous energy. They rarely slept more than 5 or 6 hours, so they could wear out colleagues and friends. They both, despite their determination and this energy, were not immune to low spirits. PAULI suffered from mood disorders until she was diagnosed in midlife with a thyroid disorder. In fact, she had a partial thyroidectomy. And then Eleanor Roosevelt suffered from symptoms that were depression-like. In fact, probably in this day, she might have been diagnosed as suffering from depression from time to time, and that this could be particularly pronounced when she felt that she had failed or that she had been rejected by people who meant a lot to her. I was also intrigued to learn that they were both innately shy, which really is a surprise to people who knew them or knew of them because they were such forceful personalities. And what I learned is that they pushed themselves past their innate shyness to be outspoken and to fight for issues that were dear to their heart. So it was a great revelation to me that on face value, when we look at these two women who seem to be very, very different, shared so much in common.
I mean, as you're talking, I can think of like 10 things that absolutely amazed me about this book. That I don't even, I'm like, oh my gosh, I know. Like when I was thinking about Eleanor, she has set the standard for first ladies now because she took on these things that before her, I'm not sure that there were many first ladies that took on causes the way she did, or it was much of a voice, right?
Exactly. She redefined what it meant or what it could mean to be a first lady. And there were signs that she might do this early on. For example, when Franklin Roosevelt was elected governor of the state of New York, she refused to move completely out of Manhattan because she was involved in work that was enormously satisfying to her. She was a principal and a teacher at the Todd Hunter School in New York City, and she taught history, which she loved, as you and I do. Mm-hmm. And she was determined that she was not going to give that up, so that she would commute back and forth between Manhattan and the governor's mansion in Albany, so that she could continue her teaching and her work with the school, but then also maintain her responsibilities as the First Lady of New York. Now, when she moved into the White House, the president made it very clear that it was not going to be possible for her to commute back and forth between Washington and Manhattan. And so shortly after his election, it was clear to her that her life would change, and that caused her to be depressed a bit. But over time, what she managed to do was to figure out a way in which she could maintain some engagement in the issues and the causes that were close to her. And that was a delicate dance for her because there were times when the causes that were closest to her heart involved bucking up against people with whom the president needed to have a good relationship, particularly some of the senators and congressmen in the South. Take, for example, the issue of anti-lynching legislation. She wanted very much to see the Congress pass a bill an anti-lynching bill. And Franklin Roosevelt was in favor of the idea but did not want to speak out for fear of making enemies with congressmen and senators from whom he needed support for other legislation. And so she worked with other people to try to speak out on that. And eventually she did make a statement. The president never made a statement in support of anti-lynching legislation, but she did. And one of the issues that I detail in the book is the case of a young black sharecropper, Odell Waller, who was convicted in the shooting death of his white landlord and employer, Oscar Davis, in Virginia. And he believed that he had shot in self-defense. And PAULI, who happened to be working with a civil rights agency that took on his case, collected information that suggested that he probably did shoot in what he thought was self-defense, because this particular planter did carry a gun and regularly used it. And what PAULI and the agency she worked for, the Workers' Defense Fund, hoped was that they could either get him a new trial or get clemency. I mean, there was never any doubt that he shot the man, but that he shot in self-defense, and they wanted to get his sentence. They wanted it commuted to manslaughter or life in prison. And the president would not get involved, but Eleanor did everything she possibly could behind the scenes, including get on a train and go to Virginia to make a personal appeal to the governor to grant clemency. And she tried to appeal to her husband at the last minute to save his life. And that was a really important turning point in this friendship, because it was when PAULI saw how hard Eleanor worked to save Odell Waller's life that she became convinced that the First Lady was not simply playing politics, that she was very serious about issues of justice. And so that happened that case went from 1940 to 1942. And in that time period, there was a major turning point in their friendship. And they became closer and moved beyond becoming simply political allies. And then in 1945, after Franklin Roosevelt died in office and the First Lady moved out of the White House, their friendship began to include discussions about personal issues. They began to have lunch and meet at Eleanor Roosevelt's private residency. By the 50s, PAULI was going up to Val-Kill for lunches and overnight at Eleanor Roosevelt's cottage, Val-Kill, so that we see this friendship that starts in earnest with a letter in 1938. By the time Eleanor Roosevelt dies in 1962, being one that had become a friendship that is characterized by mutual respect, honesty, candidness, genuine caring, all of the characteristics that we associate with a close friendship. And this is a period of over about 28 years. We see them move from, actually they start out as very contentious correspondence, disagreements about how the Franklin Roosevelt's administration and the First Lady should respond to various issues. So they move from a relationship that's characterized by contention to one that's characterized by respect, admiration, and compassion.
Yeah, and I really have to hand it to Eleanor Roosevelt for answering those letters, because it would have been so easy to just, it wasn't like she wasn't doing anything else at the time. I mean, but she really took it upon. I mean, I think that she hit her in her heart with the way that her letters were worded, that she understood it wasn't that she was trying to be critical, for the sake of being critical, but really trying to urge her to listen to her side. And,
exactly.
And I love the fact that you were able to get those letters, and it made me miss writing letters. When you're reading their letters back and forth, I'm thinking, what we miss in text messages, it was such a beautiful art form of getting across, your sentiment and heartfelt, and I don't know. I love that part of it.
When I read the first letter that Pauli Murray wrote to Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, it just touched my heart. And one of the things I learned in working on Pauli Murray for almost 20 years now is that she was first and foremost a writer. I mean, now she is applauded for the activist she was, for the frontiers that she, for the barriers that she broke, becoming an Episcopal priest. Her background as a lawyer. She's one of the co-founders of the National Organization for Women. Part of the work she did in law school was an essay that Thurgood Marshall used as part of the foundation for the 1954 Brown decision. Just recently, in October of this year, Yale University, from which she earned her third law degree, her doctorate in the science of law, just dedicated the Pauli Murray College, which is a residential college. All the residences have names. Yes, so that Yale has recognized her contributions to the nation by honoring her, by naming one of the. There were two new colleges designated in October. One was the Pauli Murray College, and the other was Benjamin Franklin College. And just this past April, her childhood home in Durham was designated a National Historic Landmark by the National Historic Trust Preservation, so that now one can go to Durham, North Carolina, and see the home that she grew up in with her grandparents, and they are in the process of renovating that home and building a visitors welcome center. So this has been a really, really big year for Pauli Murray in terms of recognition, because it is not surprising that you didn't hear about her coming up, because even though she is just as important as Thurgood Marshall and a number of the other civil rights leaders, I would say almost as important as Martin Luther King, her story has not been told, but it is getting out there. So I've just been very pleased about that. But one of the things I wanted to say about the letters, because you were talking about how much you were drawn into them, Pauli saw herself, despite all her achievements, as first and foremost a writer. So it's very clear to me when I was doing the research that she took all of her writing very seriously, and rarely did she send a letter to Eleanor or anybody without several drafts. So she thought very long and hard, very seriously. She wanted to get the tone and the words just right, because she was looking to touch someone's heart. She was looking to move issues forward. And so she really labored over her letters. And one of the letters that really touched me was a letter that she wrote it was shortly after she had thyroidectomy. And it too, I thought, represented a turning point, because it was the first time that she explained to Eleanor Roosevelt that there were some health issues that had that affected how she functioned. And let me see. And if I may, I'd like to just read just a section of it. She writes.
Yes.
And this is after Eleanor Roosevelt has appeared at the hospital unexpectedly, and PAULI is just beside herself with excitement and gratitude. And this is what she writes. And at the top of this letter was written confidential and personal. And she writes, my reason for behaving as I've done over the years, of being an unreconstructed rebel, of searching in many places for the answers to my life, is due in large part to the double tragedy of my parents, whose ages and the ages of whose children largely correspond to those of the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt family. My mother, whose picture you saw, died in 1914 when I was just over 3, from what was diagnosed as a cerebral accident. However, a rumor arose at the same time that she committed suicide because she was in her 7th pregnancy. My father was hopelessly mentally ill, and under these conditions, my mother could not face bringing an additional child into the world. 3 years later, my father was hospitalized in Crownsville, and 6 years later, he was murdered by guards there. 2 of my own siblings have been hospitalized in mental institutions, and the fear of insanity has hung over all 6 of us, despite evidence of stamina and intellect. This double tragedy has cast a shadow over a very fine, potentially creative family, and we have not known how to handle it. We have been afraid that the tragedy of our own lives would be handed on to our descendants, and the trauma of this has caused each of us to turn to trim our souls and never hope for any recognition in accordance with our respective abilities. And then she mentions that her thyroidectomy. She says, now that I have found a partial answer to the emotional thyroid storms which have tipped me over at every important step in my life, and somehow you have been aware of them, I want to see if I can do something further to straighten out our lives and leave us free to do good work in the world. So,
wow.
And it goes on, but this was an important letter because her family history is something that she doesn't talk about. And partly she doesn't talk about it is because in this time period, to have any kind of mental health issue has tremendous stigma. I mean, now, we don't flinch a lot when we hear, my cousin or I or somebody has suffered from depression or so-and-so has anxiety issues or some other concern. But in this time period, to have any kind of mental health concern was a real stain on the family. So that she mustered the courage to speak to Eleanor Roosevelt about this demonstrates that they had reached another level in the friendship in terms of intimacy. And Eleanor Roosevelt could understand this because she too suffered from low spirits. She had suffered the loss of a father who suffered from alcoholism as well as mental health issues. So these were not concerns that were foreign to her. And so the fact that she could relate to what PAULI was describing was really important to PAULI. And I think that one of the most important aspects or dynamics of this friendship was the sense to which PAULI felt acceptance by Eleanor Roosevelt. And
felt equal, yes.
Yes, and as I have done talks this past year, I have been really amazed at the number of people who have stood up and said, I met, and these are always older people, and some veterans who will say, I met Eleanor Roosevelt once. These are not people who were friends of hers, and they talk about her magnetism, her warmth, and the extent to which they felt that they were the only person in her eyes at the moment, that she sort of oozed acceptance and warmth and made them feel as if they were the center of the universe for that moment in which they stood in front of her. So she had that ability to make people feel like they were really being heard, and that was one of her personal goals in life, to be able to listen to people, and where possible to act on pleas for help. She told PAULI that she tried to answer every letter that she received. Every letter. Now, she did have a secretary, but she read every letter, and she would dictate a response. And if it was someone she knew personally, she might type it herself. But it's good that she didn't handwrite, because I don't know if you've seen Eleanor Roosevelt's handwriting. It is really indecipherable. But she never wanted a letter to go unresponded to. So she was very serious about that. And in her first year, we're talking hundreds and thousands of letters that she processed through her office, with her, her personal secretary. I mean,
wow.
And when people asked for something, she tried to identify an agency within the government that could
help
that
them.
could respond to the
Yeah.
to the issue. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what really caught me was the fact that when she was writing to PAULI, and near the end of her life, towards the end of her life, I would say, she would say to her, to tell you how much she trusted her, she would say, this is for your eyes only, or I trust this doesn't go further. And, because she really put herself out there that if she didn't trust PAULI and PAULI would have taken the letter to the press, she was really expressing things that she wanted kept between the two of them. And I was like, wow, she really trusted this woman. She knew she could,
Exactly. Like one letter when she said, if well, I'm paraphrasing now. Essentially, if I had my way, I'd just assume the president not run. I'd like to be free to do as I please. Now, can you imagine somebody in this day and age getting a letter from the first lady that says that and sitting on it?
No. They can't think it, let alone write it down.
Exactly.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Patricia. This has been amazing. I mean, I can tell the love that you put into this book, and I am so grateful that I got to read it. I mean, I am so grateful that I found it and that I found you, and there are so many things in this book that change the way I look at things, and I encourage everyone to go read it. And I will have all of your links. I will have your Amazon link for the book, and then, of course, your social media links. But I just want to thank you for taking your time out to talk to me today.
Well, I'm so appreciative, Michelle, that you invited me to come on. I am very excited and very happy to be part of the Writing Fund family and to be among those authors interviewed, and so happy to share this story of this friendship, because I think particularly at this moment in the history of the country, to have a friendship between two people who were so different, who managed to maintain a relationship and grow and learn from each other, is such a marvelous example that I think serves us well.
Yes, I do too. Thank you so much, Patricia. Have a great day.
So, wow. If you have made it to the end of that talk with Patricia, I mean, you are just as blown away as I am. I mean, what a woman. She really knew her stuff. And this book, I cannot say enough about it. If you are a history person like I am, you will love this book. And I just loved hearing her talk about ELEANOR and PAULI. I could have talked to her all day. I really hated to end that conversation. And so anyway, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. And I just hope that you were as blessed as I was to be able to listen to her and to listen to her read some of the letters from ELEANOR. It was amazing. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit like underneath, and have a great day. Thanks. Bye.